And just a few feet into this mid-spring, late spring tree ID hike here at the Tri-Town Forest in New London County, Connecticut. I'm going to work on pitch pine first because I know I can find it at this entrance to the park. And we're at the northeast corner of this property. It's a large tract of land with quite a bit of diversity of plant life. And often thin soils on the ridge tops have pitch pine in this area, and the sand plains can as well. And this is a sand plain here. It's not really flat, but there's lots of sand and gravel in the valleys around here, and the drier soil can give the pitch pine a place where it can grow where other trees are less likely to grow. And the bark on the pitch pine tends to be these large kind of purplish orange plates, and red pine can get a similar look, and so can shortleaf pine, but neither one of those are found native in this area. Could find some planted red pine, but the thing about pitch pine is it came into this sandy gravelly area as a pioneer species, and unless we get some openings in the canopy, you don't find pitch pine seedlings underneath the pitch pine. You find other trees, including this white pine here, which has a little white line on the back of the needles. You can barely see that there. The needles come in bundles of 5. So we'll be on the lookout for pitch pine seedlings today, but I don't expect to find too many because this forest is going through succession. Unless we have a fire or a clearing, it gives those pitch pine cones a chance to warm up and open up. They're not likely to germinate. But here's some more of that bark here on these pitch pines. These plates are about the size of my fingers. Maybe a little larger on some trees. But the white pine has taken over the understory here along with some red maple. And that pitch pine tree is deceased. And the ones that are still getting sun are still alive, and they can live a while. They don't die as quickly as some pioneer species. And here's the seed source for the trees that are coming in to replace it, our white pine, which has plates on the bark, but they tend to be a little less of that purplish orange color, more of a brown color, almost tan colored. And they can get large plates on the older white pine trees. This tree is a couple feet around, but it's not that old, so they can get large plates as the trees age. We'll look for that as we find it today. So we're going to hike about 5 or 6 hours back here. As we go up in elevation, we're going to get out of this sand plain, the sand and gravel in this valley, and get onto what's called glacial till, which is basically soil that's been comprised of the bedrock that's from around here, and some of the bedrock north of here would have got pushed south by the glaciers. Chunks of that bedrock get mixed in with the bedrock here and ground up into soil. But most glacial till is soil is derived mostly from the bedrock nearby. So we'll see a change in the plants as we go up what's called Ricktown Mountain here, and see how many different trees we can find in that time. A lot of oak, a lot of hickory back here, some maple, some birch. I recorded basswood back here last year at the other end of this park. We might be able to find some at this end as well. And just a little further up the hill here, I found a white pine that's slowly dying, but it had an interesting tale to tell. It grew up straight to here and then got bent over, it looks like, and twisted around, kind of grew onto itself. The bark kind of meshed together and then went back up towards the sun again. Not a lot of needles on it at this point. It's probably getting near the end of its existence. But a lot of trees can do that. They don't usually die if they get snapped over, as long as they're not broken completely. And eventually they'll correct course and head towards the sun. And I've got a pitch pine here that's had a wind damage. You can look at the cones and the needles. The needles on pitch pine can get real long if it's getting enough sun. Sometimes they're only 2 or 3 inches long. These are about 6 inches long. They always come in bundles of 3. And we got 3 in a bundle right there. Right there under my thumb you can see 3, and right next to it you can see 3 coming out. The cones tend to be almost as wide as they are long, and at the bottom of each cone scale you get a little barb, or a prickle it's called, right there by my thumb. Another tree that resembles pitch pine pretty much grows in the central Appalachians from Pennsylvania south to North Carolina and Georgia. It's called Table Mountain pine. It again only grows where it can get sun, and the cones open up after a heat source, either direct sun or a fire, allow them to do so and germinate. They have a prickle that's much larger than that, and could hurt you. Looks like a cat claw. It's been an effort by the owners of this land, which is the Avalonia Land Trust, to try to get the pitch pine reestablished in this park. Done an intentional clearing here, and some of the pitch pines are going to make it, but most of them don't look like they're going to unless they get a lot of extra nursing. Here's one they've actually put this material around to keep the deer from eating it, and it's getting enough sun that it's feebly growing. It doesn't look too healthy to me. I've seen pitch pines with new growth that's much longer shoots than that, so we'll wish them luck. It's getting plenty of sun here, so it might have a chance. But again, this is a pioneer species, and unless it has the right habitat, it will go through, the forest will go through succession, the pitch pine will go away. But in areas with real thin soil, it's often the population will last because of the thin soil, more sun, and the increased likelihood of brush fires. Might as well enjoy these spring wildflowers while we're here. These are called bluets. Pretty small. They come in large bunches, and they sure are pretty. And that sand and gravel at the bottom third of Ricktown Mountain here yields to almost all bedrock ledge with a little bit of dirt between the bedrock. But there's plenty of trees up here. We're going to look for noteworthy examples as we go today. We don't have to get every tree. Try to use what Mother Nature gives us on this hike today. I believe this is a hop hornbeam, but it doesn't really have the bark to prove it. The tree is still too young. But what we do have is a doubly toothed leaf. Right there. So it's a leaf with a large tooth, small tooth, large tooth, small tooth. Now the birches get that as well. It has the young bark, has little lenticels on it, just like the birch bark. This looks a lot like a black birch sapling, but I don't think it is. And I'm going to prove it by scratching back just a little bit of this bark, not enough to harm the tree here, and smell it. And I just smelled the bark where I scratched it back, and there's no smell of oil of wintergreen. So that helps me know that it's not a black birch, but it is probably a hop hornbeam. The American hornbeam has a younger bark that's more gray in color, like the American beech. Hop hornbeam gets a real shaggy bark when the tree gets a little older, but when they're this small, it almost looks like ochre. It really could look like a lot of trees. So those doubly toothed leaves help me narrow it down that it could be a hop hornbeam or a black or yellow birch, and then I used the scratch test to take that choice away and leave me with was probably a hop hornbeam. And after looking at that hop hornbeam, what I believe is a hop hornbeam leaf, back on the subject of birches, should be at least 3 species, probably 4 species of birches back here today. The one that's hard to find in mature woods is this paper birch. This one is dead. It needs full sun just like that pitch pine to hang around. It's a pioneer species often found in old farmland or land that's been logged or burned or along roadsides. It has white bark just like the gray birch, but I believe this is a paper birch just because of the size. It's about 1 foot around. And it is peeling even though it's dead. The bark is peeling in a paper-like fashion, which the gray birch normally doesn't do. So you can see those little curls and furls right here. And the yellow birch does that as well. So you can harvest the bark off the dead trees, the dead limbs, which you're often going to find. Because they're short-lived trees, you often find dead limbs on the ground underneath the live ones. And in a survival situation, it makes a great fire starter. I'm actually going to pour a little water on this. I've got it on a rock here so it doesn't spread into the woods on a sunny day. Pour a little water on this bark here. It has a natural oil called oil of wintergreen, which is flammable and will burn when wet. You might have to try a little harder to get it lit. But once you do get it lit, it's easy to keep it lit. Once that oil starts igniting, it'll evaporate the water that's on the surface of the bark and give you a real good chance to get a fire started on a rainy day. And I know when I was in scouting, one of our tests was a one-match fire. And I'll tell you what, if you use birch bark and the dead limbs of a cedar tree, the undergrowth of a cedar tree, you had a guarantee of getting a fire going with one match. So here's what we got here in a survival situation. This would work with yellow birch as well. So we'll go ahead and put this out and keep hiking. And just up the trail from that hop hornbeam, which I'm starting to see a lot of on this hillside, I do believe we have a black birch here. With that doubly toothed edge. Just like the hop hornbeam. If I scratch back the bark on this, it again has these little white lenticels on there that look similar to the hop hornbeam. And the trees are second cousins. They're not in the same genus, but they are both in the birch family. Like that would explain the similarities. Like these little lenticels and the doubly toothed edge. We'll scratch this back and give it a sniff. And that is a very strong smell of oil of wintergreen, which is the flavor of wintergreen lifesavers or root beer. And yes, you can make root beer from these trees, and they do. They're pretty common in Pennsylvania, and if you go to Pennsylvania, a lot of stores sell birch beer. So there's our doubly toothed edge. The other thing is the birch leaves come in pairs. They always come out by twos, and the hornbeams do not. So that's another way we can tell them apart. We got this branch with 2 leaves here and 2 leaves here coming out from the same point on the branch. And that point almost looks like a spur on a rooster's foot before it gets the leaf. We'll look for some larger examples of the black birch and the hop hornbeam as we hike today. And these hop hornbeam leaves show the point I just made about the birches coming out in pairs, and these do not. They tend to come in bunches where they're not all the same size. These haven't fully grown, but you can see there's a large leaf, a medium leaf, and a small leaf out of the same spot. And this tree is large enough to have that telltale bark that's quite shaggy, Kind of like a shagbark hickory, but the shags are much smaller, and that's pretty unique to this area. There's no other tree that has a bark that looks like this. When the tree is 3 or 4 inches around, it starts to get that appearance. But this younger branch here could easily be taken for that of a black birch. Keep looking at wildflowers today. This is the second week of May. So, been pretty cool lately, but some of these plants are giving it their best anyways. And this columbine is in full bloom. Well, every time I've ever found it growing anywhere, it's always on a rock or near a rock. And a little bit along the roadsides around here too, but again, it's usually on rocks. So, beautiful little leaves here. Water always beads up off those leaves when it's raining. Well, one way we can tell what the woods are going to look like in a couple generations are what we find reproducing in the shade of the trees that are here. I mentioned that the white pines were growing underneath those pitch pines, the seedlings were, and they'll probably take over unless something gives those pitch pines an advantage. And here's a oak tree that's quite shade tolerant, can grow in the shade of itself and other trees, and often becomes dominant on these ridge tops. This is our chestnut oak. Just starting to leaf out here, so they don't have the obvious features of a chestnut oak leaf, but you can start to see them. It's got a wavy edge and not very deep notches between the lobes. And our white oak also has a wavy edge, but deeper notches between the lobes, and also less of them. And they're both growing on this ridge top here. I've got a white oak right here with the ash gray colored bark. Boy, in sunny days like this, it's hard to tell the oaks apart because everything is overexposed to the point where even a black oak looks like this. But this is a white oak. One way I can tell is by some of the upper branches have flakes of bark coming off that come off like the hinge on a door sideways. We'll look at those if we see them closer today. And it's also one of the last trees to get its leaves. Some of the other oaks are already starting to get leaves, and this is just barely leafing out right there. Plenty more chestnut oak seedlings coming up here, and boy, when those acorns come down, and they come down in quantity every year, and they set root almost immediately. In September, October, November, the acorns come down, the cap always comes off right away, and you get a chestnut oak sprout even before the first hard freezes sometimes. So it gives them a chance to get going and start ahead of the other trees. This is mostly white oak right here, but I know there's chestnut oak right here as well. There's a white oak. And the deeply furrowed bark of a chestnut oak usually gives it away. Not too many other trees that get deeply furrowed bark like that. This one here's kind of been bent over. I've seen deeper furrows than this on what chestnut oak, but it does have the appearance, the texture of a chestnut oak. And an intentional clearing here to get a view at the wooded hills of this area. And looking up, we mentioned that the white oak was setting seed in this forest, and it's already here in great quantity, and it's starting to get its leaves, but they're only a small fraction of their normal size. And just down the trail, we got a northern red oak that's, the leaves are almost fully grown. So, this is mid-May. One way you can do a tree ID is, when the leaves come and go, what color they turn. And this northern red oak, and if you've watched any of my tree ID videos before, we've done a lot with the bark pattern. I probably don't need to do it again, but it does have these flat top ridges that extend from the top all the way to the bottom. Sometimes they start to weave in and out in a braided pattern on the larger trees. But looking up today, boy, for today's hike, an oak tree that has its leaves and the leaves are almost fully grown is going to be not a chestnut oak and not a white oak, but a red oak. northern red oak. Plenty of crumbling ledges back here. And got a little bit of this American hornbeam here, which is the one that's called musclewood. Not too muscular yet, but it's starting to get the appearance of that. As the tree gets older, the muscles and the tendons get much more pronounced. And again, doubly toothed edge, just like our birches. You can see that right here. And they don't come out in pairs, but this one almost looks like it is, but it's not. It's just starting to open up, so they're not fully leafed out, but it tends to be a medium, large, and small leaves all from the same area. And again, lenticels on the younger bark, even though the older bark is easy to tell from the other trees. When it's still really small like this, you'd have to do your scratch test to prove that it's not a birch. And we're down off that rocky ridge. It's still rocky here, but not quite as much. And very, very green down here. More leaf out on the non-oak trees than on the oak trees. Even though that northern red oak had full leaf out, a lot of the other ones didn't. But we're getting down into a lowland area here. Things look pretty doggone green. And did a lot of work with basswood last year. It kind of looks like the other trees as you're walking by. There's nothing real obvious about the bark as far as the color goes. And yes, other trees can get this. But this often is the way I can tell basswood as I'm walking. It grows in clumps. You might find a tree by itself, but usually there's 2 or 3 or 4 or more growing in a clump. And it often gets these rows of holes in it from the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Fortunately, that does not kill the tree. But it's one way I can tell basswood bark. Or at least help me narrow down that it could be a basswood, and then I'll use other features like the leaves, which are a little bit out of sight from here, but they are heart-shaped and they're starting to open up. And if we really look up there, we might be able to see a few. I can see them clearly. I don't think the camera can. Actually, if we come right down to the ground, there's a root sprout here. And basswood does sprout from the roots. And these are nowhere near the full size. They have a real coarsely toothed edge. It's singly toothed instead of doubly toothed. And heart-shaped. And they get as big as your hand, so these are just starting to open up. Blue sky's been a little hard to come by the last few weeks. It's been cool and cloudy most of April and May. And we'll use this blue sky to our advantage. Really take a look up and appreciate the leaf out here. This is a black birch. It's not that big. It's about 1.5 feet around, but as they get older, the bark goes from being smooth and bronze colored to platy. And the yellow birch can do the same thing, even though it peels at a younger age and is an obvious bronzish yellow color. We'll look at those today if we find them. But both these trees get platy bark as they get much older. Not always bigger in size, just older in age. So a lot of times you see a lot of black birch that are this size that are still smooth, but as they get older, not always bigger, they get this platy appearance. So this is an older black birch. I believe this is one here too. I wasn't quite sure what this was as I was walking. It almost looked like a black cherry, but it's not. So pretty sure this is a black birch, but I'm pretty confident it is. But it definitely looks like a black cherry or even a black oak at a walking pace with all these little flat top plateaus. So as trees get older, they can change their appearance. And moist soil along this small stream here. Got plenty of false hellebore and skunk cabbage growing in this muck. And a tree that has bark that could almost confuse us with that chestnut oak up on the ridge top. Tends to be more polygon shaped than furrows, but it can get furrows that are quite deep like a chestnut oak. And it can also get these little polygons. They're a couple inches across. And a late bloomer. This is one of the last trees to get its leaves. It's just starting to leaf out. If you look up to the top, this tree almost looks dead, but it's not. And way up there, you can just start to see the leaves opening up on this black gum, which in this area pretty much grows in the moister soils in these little swampy areas. Forested swamps, it can become even dominant in some of them. And just after looking at that, I guess I was working my way back down the tree with the camera. Boy, a few more days these will be open. They're just starting to open, these pink azaleas. It'll be beautiful for a few weeks in the second half of May here. And here's another black gum right over here that really shows that bark pattern. Usually it's this polygon shape that makes it easy to point out or pick out amongst the other trees. They're often 5 or 6 sided pentagons and hexagons. There's a 6-sided one right there, 5-sided. But occasionally you'll get ridges and furrows. If we look up the tree, we can see some of that. Right up there. The tree I probably won't get to anytime soon is called the persimmon, and it gets a similar bark pattern with the polygons. It's more of a southern tree. I was finding it in the Ohio Valley occasionally when I was living out there. I never got to recording it. So if you're in an area where it's a little further south, persimmon trees get a very similar bark pattern. The bark tends to be quite a bit darker, almost black. And we've got another larger, older black birch here. Not quite as different looking as the one we looked at a few minutes ago that had bark that almost looked like a black cherry or a black oak. This has the starting to get the cardboard sheets that come off of it, about the size of a thickness of a sheet of cardboard. So nowhere near as curling as and furling as a paper birch or a yellow birch, which I've got right over here. Got one right here. It's just a small tree. It's curling and furling. This one over here has got plenty of sun to really see that yellow color. But if yellow birches have time to live, and they can live for hundreds of years, they will get platy bark like that and lose the curling and furling, at least on the bottom of the tree. So there's our yellowish color and curling and furling. And yes, if we were to find a deceased tree, we could harvest this bark for a fire starter as well. You're less likely to find dead limbs or whole trees dead like you do the paper birch. So do the tree a favor and either find a paper birch for your fire starter or look carefully, and sure enough, here's some on the ground right here from a limb that fell down. So that would work as a fire starter as well. River birch works as well if you're in an area where you find river birch. I've tried it, it works as well. Black birch and gray birch. I don't think the black birch bark would work. I've never tried gray birch. If we find some today, I might try that. And there's an old quarry I'm going to get to eventually. It might have some gray birch growing on the bottom of it, where it's recently just became woods. We'll see if we can find some and try it. And I don't always script these seasonal tree IDs hikes. But some of the information I put on these hikes I didn't use when I made specific videos for these trees. So it's a good way to add to that. But lots of black birch on this hike, lots of different varieties of how the bark looks, different variations on how the bark looks on black birch. So that'll be one thing we'll emphasize today, because that's what I'm finding. And yes, look how that's peeling off in big sheets. I don't believe this is flammable. I've never actually tried. I'm not going to try it today. To get something that thick to burn would probably be a challenge, and also the woods are kind of dry, so let's not take a chance of making a problem. Look at how that's peeling off. New England Forest is on YouTube. Those guys really know their stuff, and that's where I really learned about how these birch trees can change, and the guy that leads that most of the time, the guy with the long beard, I forgot his name, I think it's Tom, says at about 50 years of age, the black birch goes from being fairly smooth to getting these big exfoliations of bark, to the point where it's not smooth at all. So that's what I'm guessing the age of this tree is. And plenty of hickory on today's hike. I've walked by hundreds of them. We'll nibble away at it. Now that most of them are getting their leaves, we can narrow it down pretty quickly to 2 species that have 5 leaflets on a compound leaf. And this one does. And that's probably either a shagbark or a pignut hickory. And not a lot else for me to work with on this tree, because shagbarks don't shag up till they get a little larger. I'm guessing it's a shagbark just by a couple other subtle features that I won't try to explain. And this one here has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that would probably make it a mocker nut. Or there's one that I'm still learning, and I think actually that's what this is. It's got the features of mocker nut and a pig nut. It's considered a variation of the pig nut, and that's a red hickory, and it has a red bottom of the stem. That's called the rachis, R-A-C-H-I-A-S. And it's been confusing me in the winter because part of it looks like a mocker nut and part of it looks like a pig nut. But it's got more leaflets on average than a mocker nut, than a pig nut. So it could look like a mocker nut, but the bark is a little too flaky on a lot of them, and the red bottom of this makes me think it could be a red hickory. So I'm going to do more with red hickory when I really get it figured out. But the nuts are confusing too, because it often has round nuts instead of watermelon shaped nuts like the mocker nut gets, and it doesn't have the teardrop shaped nuts that the pig nut gets. So it's kind of in its own grouping, and I'm still waiting for the botanist to figure out what it exactly is. But most of these have 5 leaflets, but there's a few that have 7. And the lack of mortar in this foundation lets me believe it's quite old. And the fact this land is so rocky, most of the farmers headed west as soon as better land was available in the valleys of New York State, western New York, and Pennsylvania. So pretty good handiwork here for this. Looks like a square house foundation right here with a chimney starting in the basement and coming right up where that almost looks like a lilac growing out of there. So that's obviously not native. And got some good bark identification right here. We got a hickory here with smooth gray bark that does not peel at all. It doesn't break free at either end of these little furrows. And that usually makes it a mocker nut. And I've got the proof here because it's got leaves that are starting to come out that always have more than 5 leaflets. So we got a compound leaf right here, almost in view. Right there was 7. And they can have more than that sometimes. So I'm using the fact that the bark is tightly packed together, it doesn't break free on either end, and the fact that it has more than 5 leaflets to help me determine that it's not a pig nut, and probably not a red hickory, just because the bark on the red hickories tends to break free on either end of the ridges. And here's an obvious example of a shagbark. That's one of the easier trees to learn. I don't need to do a lot with shagbark because it's so easy to tell apart. Although red maple can get this shaggy appearance too. And if you lived in an area where shellbark hickory is found, it gets this appearance as well. The shagbark hickory always has 5 leaflets, or almost always has 5 leaflets on its compound leaf. And in most hardwood forests that have been around a while and don't have a lot of natural openings, your dogwood kind of goes away. It's more in old field situations, old pastures, along road edges. It's a beautiful tree, but it's hard to find in parks that have been parks for a while. I was at Sleeping Giant last year doing a spring tree study, and I didn't see hardly any. I think I saw one off in the distance. And but boy, this flowering dogwood sure is pretty. But if you're hiking in the woods, you may not see a lot of it, unless it's a woods that just became woods. Because this area is so rocky in southern New England, most of the woods has been woods a while. Let's see if we can get a look at these flowers here. There we are. You get a little more sun now to really see the beautiful flowers. Pretty popular landscape tree for that reason. The beautiful flowers, it gets handsome foliage that turns a crimson color in the fall, plus red berries on the ends of the branches that persist into the winter. So it has a lot to offer. The bark resembles that of the black gum we looked at a while ago as far as the polygons on it, but they're much, much smaller. You really wouldn't get them confused. And this is the polygons I'm talking about. And again, this dogwood has just gotten too much shade. It's dead. I've seen a lot of dead ones today. This is the first one, this first grove I found where there was actually some live ones to record. So these woods have been woods just a little too long for the dogwood to persist. So kind of like the paper birch we talked about and the pitch pine, this isn't really a pioneer species, more than a species that needs sun. So it doesn't come in after fires or anything like that, but it tends to need sun to stick around. So without humans around this part of the world, it would probably only be found in open ledges where it gets enough sun, or maybe some prairies if you go further west, the edge of prairies, but probably not in mature woods. So it's probably become more common since humans have started living in this part of the world, especially since the Europeans have come around and started farming. So these little polygons are pretty obvious. None of the leaves are within view, but they're pretty unique looking. If we can find some, we'll look at them. And that flowering dogwood, this is called, and the alternate leaf dogwood are on this channel where you can see the leaves. And just to get back with the black birch, we saw that one a little while ago that had the huge sheets coming off. This one is almost the same size, but obviously not quite as old. The bark is still intact. It's a smooth, kind of a brownish bronze color. And yes, this pink azalea here is just a little bit more advanced than the one we saw a little while ago. So let's admire that. Well, that sure is pretty. Been watching some guys hiking the Appalachian Trail on YouTube this year. And they're coming through Virginia. And they're just seeing the pink azaleas everywhere. So, not too common on most of the hikes they do around here, but it's occasional. If you get up on ridge tops where there's plenty of sun, it's more common. I also tend to find it on the edge of wetlands. There we are right there. And a little more chestnut oak sapling here for us to look at. And the parent tree is right up the trail here. This one really shows the furrowed bark that I was talking about earlier. This is what they normally look like. furrows 2 to 3 inches deep, covering the tree the whole way up. And yes, our northern red oak can kind of look like this, especially when they get really big. And our cottonwood can look like this, but there just isn't a lot of cottonwood normally found in hardwood forests. It's usually on floodplains and in old field situations, pioneer species situations. And we'll look at a little bit more hop hornbeam with this curling bark, but the curls are quite narrow, only a 1/4 inch wide usually. Hop hornbeam can almost get as big as the other trees, but it's definitely an understory tree. It can get to 50 or 60 feet, but usually it doesn't. But it does get quite a bit taller than its cousin American hornbeam with the muscular looking bark. I think we got a good example of a pignut hickory bark to compare with that mocker nut we looked at a little while ago. So very similar in color, and it has all this braided appearance just like the mocker nut, but it tends to come to little points at the end, or the braids will stop and start again. Little square ends like that. And if we look up high enough, we can see it has 5 leaflets instead of 7 or 9. I can see that. I don't think the camera could. There's some other trees kind of between here and there, but I can see it clearly. And when I have any doubt, I just start looking for nuts on the ground. And usually that can prove it, but we're getting some of, I think, what's called red hickory around here, which has characteristics of both. But in theory, the pig nut has a teardrop shaped nut that's got a thin husk. It's not very big, maybe 1 inch in size. And the thin husk is peeling off right there. It's teardrop shaped. You can see how thin it is on this one here. And on that one there, maybe an 1/8 inch thick. And a mocker nut hickory is at least a 1/4 inch thick. And the shagbark hickory husk is a 1/2 inch thick. They're quite thick. So, and this red hickory that's throwing me a curveball, it looks like a lot of the above, is more of a round nut. And I'm going to try to get that completely figured out, and then I'll make a video on red hickory when I think I really know what I'm looking at, because it's labeled as a subspecies of pignut. Honestly, I think it looks more like a mocker nut as far as the leaves and the bark than the pignut, just from a visual point of view, not from genetics or anything else. So here we go. Got just a few minutes left to hike today. We're going to get to an old quarry in a minute here. I'd like to look in there and see if we can find some pioneer species, maybe some gray birch or some aspens. Well, we are back in this old quarry. This rock around here is called gabbro, G-A-B-B-R-O. And it breaks into nice angular chunks that can be used for road construction, things like that. It packs good. Pieces all fit together, as you can see right here, for the trail builders have done. I don't know how long it's been since this was abandoned, but there's no pioneer species in this quarry, in the bottom of this quarry, except maybe this white ash. White ash does tend to come in newer situations, old fields. I don't see any of it in the woods back here where the woods have been around a while. So I guess there is some white ash here. Unfortunately, it's died, or is dying from the emerald ash borer like all the other ones. But most of this is just the trees we've been seeing all day. A little bit of black birch, a little bit of red maple back here. I don't see any gray birch for us to examine. So in this case, this quarry may have just been abandoned a while ago. None of these trees are that big though. I think what it tells us is there wasn't really a seed source for the pioneer trees nearby. In other words, these woods around here have been woods for so long that the pioneer species have all been shaded out. So there wasn't a seed source within a mile of here, or a half mile of here, for the seeds to come from. because the only trees I see back here that aren't ones we've seen all day is maybe this white ash. So anyways, we're about out of time here, and I'll take a look at the trail map in just a few minutes here. This has got many trails back here, and they're all good trails. They're all scenic. They're all well designed. And I did do a hike back here in 2021 in the fall. That's on my other channel. That channel is called Let's Dig a Little Deeper. And I think it's called Fall Exploration of Connecticut's Tri-Town Forest. We basically did a lot of the other half of the park that day. I've done the eastern half today. And we'll finish this video as we started with some pines. These are the cones from the white pine tree. There's my hand for scale there. 6 inches long, 4 inches long, about that range. Pretty common on the forest floor this year. There was a lot of white pine cones last year. It was an extra bonus year for a lot of trees, including the white pines. Huge amounts of mast. So we'll use that to hold the map down. I explored this area around Lambert Mountain when I did Basswood last year. There was quite a bit of it up there. A little bit on this hike, just an occasional tree, not a lot though. Today we started up here and came down these red loops and basically took the blue and yellow loops most of the way around. I was mostly on the blue loop. There's a couple new segments of trail that aren't shown on this map, and basically did a clockwise loop around the eastern half of this preserve. Probably did 4 or 5 miles. I wasn't really keeping track of it. And I'm now on the red trail. I'm going to hike out to this road and then walk back to the car, just because I got kind of running low on time. I can make that a little quicker. And there's roadside parking at both these northern entrances for maybe 2 or 3 cars, and then roadside parking along Miller Road on the south end of the preserve, and also a small parking lot where that little blue car symbol is. Great place to learn some of the common hardwood trees around here, and a great trail network where you can see all kinds of different habitats. They really made the trails go up and around and through everything that's here. It didn't follow any straight lines for long. It's a very creative trail system.